I woke up to find my patio furniture covered in a thin sheet of ice, which wouldn't have happened if someone hadn't severed my outdoor heating cable the night before. The cable ran along the underside of my decks, overhang and around the perimeter of my backyard patio, keeping ice from building up during Denver's brutal winter months. I'd invested nearly $3,000 in that system after moving into the Pinewood Estates subdivision last spring, knowing Colorado winters could be harsh. My name is Wesley Quinn, and I'm a software engineer who works from home most days. I bought this house in Littleton, Colorado, thinking it would be a peaceful place to settle down after years of apartment living. The neighborhood seemed nice enough during the summer months, with well-maintained lawns and friendly neighbors. What I didn't account for was the homeowners association and its president, a woman named Karren Jenkins, who took her volunteer position more seriously than most people take actual careers. I discovered the severed cable when I went outside that Tuesday morning to let my dog, Max, out for his morning routine. The heating system's indicator light was flashing red instead of its usual steady green. Following the cable around the deck, I found it cleanly cut in 3 places, the exposed copper wiring gleaming in the morning sun. Someone had used heavy-duty wire cutters, and they'd done it deliberately. My first call was to the company that installed the system. They couldn't come out until Thursday, 2 days away, and warned me that ice accumulation could become a serious problem if we got the snowstorm the weather forecasters were predicting. The second call I made was to my next-door neighbor, Tom, who'd been living in Pinewood Estates for 5 years and knew all the subdivision drama. "Let me guess," Tom said when he came over to look at the damage. "You got a violation notice from Karren recently." I pulled out my phone and showed him the email I'd received 3 days prior. Karren had sent a lengthy message about how outdoor heating cables were not explicitly approved in the HOA covenants, and that I needed to submit a formal request to the Architectural Review Committee. The email was typical Karren style, with unnecessary capitalization, multiple exclamation points, and veiled threats about fines and legal action. I responded to her email, I explained to Tom. I told her the cables were installed before I moved in and that they're barely visible. Plus, they're necessary for preventing ice damage. Tom shook his head. That wouldn't matter to Karren. If it's not explicitly written in the covenants, she considers it forbidden. Last year, she tried to fine the Hendersons for painting their shutters forest green instead of the approved hunter green. She literally brought paint swatches to the HOA meeting. You think she cut my cables? I'd bet money on it. Karren's done stuff like this before. Nothing this destructive, but she's definitely taken matters into her own hands when people don't comply immediately with her demands. I examined the cuts again. They were clean and purposeful, made at strategic points that would disable the entire system. This is destruction of property. I could call the police. You could, Tom agreed. But Karren's husband is buddies with half the city council, and she'll claim she was enforcing HOA rules. You'd spend months in small claims court and probably still end up paying her legal fees somehow. These HOA boards are basically untouchable around here. That didn't sit right with me. I'd worked too hard to buy this house, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA president destroy my property without consequences. I took detailed photos of the severed cables from multiple angles, making sure to capture the clean cuts that indicated deliberate vandalism rather than animal damage or weather-related issues. The temperature was already dropping, and dark clouds were gathering over the mountains to the west. The Weather Service had upgraded their prediction from a chance of snow to a winter storm warning, expecting 8 to 12 inches starting that evening. Without the heating cables, ice would accumulate on my deck and patio, potentially causing thousands of dollars in damage. I spent the rest of the morning researching Colorado property law and HOA regulations. What I found was frustrating but not surprising. HOAs in Colorado had broad authority to enforce their covenants, but they weren't allowed to destroy property without due process. Even if Karren believed my heating cables violated HOA rules, she had no legal right to cut them without going through proper channels, which included written notices, hearings, and potential fines. Destruction of property was still a crime, regardless of HOA authority. Around noon, I received another email from Karren. This one was even more aggressive than the first, stating that she'd conducted an inspection of my property and found multiple violations, including the unauthorized heating cables, improperly stored trash cans, and a holiday wreath that was still hanging on my door past the January 15th removal deadline. The wreath thing was ridiculous since it was only January 10th, but that was classic Karren, making up violations to strengthen her position. I decided to respond professionally, keeping my anger in check. I wrote that I discovered my heating cables had been vandalized and that I'd be filing a police report. I mentioned that I had security cameras installed, which was a bluff since I hadn't gotten around to setting them up yet. I asked her directly if she had any information about who might have damaged my property. Her response came within 10 minutes. She claimed to know nothing about any vandalism and suggested that perhaps the cables had been damaged by wildlife or falling ice. She then reiterated that the cables were not approved and that I needed to remove them anyway. She ended with a threat of daily fines starting immediately if I didn't comply. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought 2 outdoor security cameras with night vision and motion detection. I installed them facing the backyard, making sure they covered all angles of the deck and patio area. I also bought several heavy-duty tarps and began covering the deck furniture and railings, trying to minimize the ice damage I knew was coming. Tom came back over around 4 in the afternoon, just as the first snowflakes started falling. "Karren's having a fit," he said. "She's been posting in the neighborhood Facebook group about your cameras, says they're violating everyone's privacy. They're pointed at my property." "I know, but she's spinning it like you're surveilling the whole neighborhood. She's trying to get people worked up about it." I pulled up the Pinewood Estates Facebook group on my phone. Sure enough, Karren had posted a long rant about security cameras and privacy concerns. Several residents had commented with supportive messages, though I noticed others pushing back, asking what the big deal was if the cameras were only covering my own yard. "She's worried," Tom observed. "If she cut your cables, she knows those cameras might catch her if she tries anything else." The snow started falling harder as evening approached. I watched the weather radar on my laptop, seeing the massive storm system moving in from the west. The meteorologists were now predicting up to 14 inches, with temperatures dropping well below freezing. This was exactly the kind of weather that made heating cables essential. By 8 that night, we already had 4 inches of snow on the ground, and ice was forming on every exposed surface. I could see it accumulating on my deck railings and the patio furniture despite the tarps. Without the heating cables keeping things just warm enough to prevent ice buildup, everything was freezing solid. I was editing some code for work when my phone rang. It was Tom. "Get to your front window right now," he said urgently. I hurried to the living room and looked outside. Karren was walking down the middle of the street, which was already covered in snow, heading toward my house. She was wearing a heavy winter coat and carrying what looked like bolt cutters. "Is she seriously coming back?" I said into the phone. "Looks like it." And this time you've got cameras running." I hung up and grabbed my phone, opening the security camera app. The backyard cameras were recording clear footage despite the falling snow, their infrared night vision cutting through the darkness. I watched as Karren appeared in the frame, walking along the side of my house toward the backyard. She stopped at my gate, fumbling with the latch. That's when I decided to confront her directly. I pulled on my boots and coat and walked out the front door, circling around to the side gate from the driveway. I reached it just as Karren was pushing it open. "Can I help you?" I asked loudly. She jumped, clearly startled. In the porch light, I could see her face clearly, her expression shifting from surprise to indignation in seconds. "I'm conducting an HOA inspection," she said, recovering quickly. "We have the right to inspect properties for covenant violations." At 8:30 at night, during a snowstorm with bolt cutters. "These are for removing unauthorized installations," she said, holding up the tool. "Your heating cables are in violation of subdivision covenants, and since you refuse to remove them, the HOA is taking corrective action. The cables are already cut. You did that last night. I have no idea what you're talking about." I pulled out my phone and opened the security camera app, turning the screen toward her. "These cameras have been recording since this afternoon. They've captured you walking onto my property with bolt cutters. That's trespassing and attempted vandalism." Karren's face reddened, visible even in the dim light. "Those cameras are illegal. You're recording people without consent. They're on my property, recording my property. That's completely legal in Colorado. What's not legal is you destroying my heating cables. That's criminal mischief and it's going to cost you." "You can't prove I did anything," she said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. "Actually, I can. Those cables were professionally installed with a specific type of housing that shows tool marks when it's cut. I've already documented everything. And now, I have video of you trespassing with the same type of tool that was used. How do you think that's going to look to the police?" "The police won't care about an HOA matter. This isn't an HOA matter anymore. This is criminal destruction of property. That system cost $3,000, and the damage to my deck and patio from ice accumulation is going to cost thousands more. This is well beyond small claims court territory." Several neighbors had noticed the commotion and were watching from their windows. I saw Tom step out onto his porch, phone in hand, clearly recording the interaction. Karren looked around, realizing she had an audience. "Fine," she said sharply. "But those cables still need to come down. The HOA board will be assessing daily fines until you comply. Send me the fines. My attorney will add them to the lawsuit." She turned and stomped back toward the street, nearly slipping on the ice. I watched until she made it back to her house 3 doors down, then went back inside, my hands shaking from adrenaline. The next morning, I filed a police report. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic but realistic about the situation. "HOA disputes are tricky," he explained. "But cutting those cables is pretty clear-cut vandalism, especially if they were already installed when you bought the house. The fact that you caught her coming back with bolt cutters helps your case. What happens now? We'll investigate. If the evidence supports criminal charges, the DA will decide whether to prosecute. But I'd recommend getting a lawyer involved for the civil side of things. You're going to want to sue for damages." I left the police station and drove directly to a law office that specialized in property disputes. The attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Morrison, listened to my story and reviewed all the documentation I'd brought. "This is one of the more blatant cases I've seen," she said. "Usually, HOA disputes are about interpretation of vague rules or procedural matters. This is just straight-up property destruction. The fact that she came back with bolt cutters while you were recording is almost unbelievable. So we have a case. Absolutely. We'll file a civil suit for the cost of repairing the heating system, any ice damage to your property, and punitive damages for her willful destruction of your property. We'll also get a restraining order preventing her from entering your property or contacting you, except through legal channels. Over the next few days, the storm continued dumping snow on Denver's southern suburbs. By Thursday afternoon, we had 16 inches on the ground, with temperatures hovering around 15 degrees. The ice buildup on my deck was severe. I could hear cracking sounds as the weight stressed the wooden structure. The railings were encased in ice several inches thick, and icicles a foot long hung from the overhang. The heating cable repair company came out Friday morning. The technician surveyed the damage and shook his head. "Someone really didn't want these working," he said. "They cut them in exactly the right places to disable the entire system. This was done by someone who either knows electrical systems or really studied how these work. How long to fix it? I can have it done by this afternoon, but honestly, you've got bigger problems now." He pointed at my deck. "That ice weight is significant. You're looking at probably 800 pounds of ice on this structure. Decks aren't designed to hold that kind of load. Is it dangerous?" "I'd stay off it until the weather warms up enough for the ice to melt. And honestly, you might want to get a structural engineer to look at it. I can see the support posts shifting from here." That made my stomach drop. The deck was one of the main reasons I'd bought this house. It was a large, two-level structure with built-in seating and space for a full outdoor kitchen. The ice damage could cost tens of thousands to repair. I called Patricia Morrison with the update. "Document everything," she said. "Get the structural engineer out there as soon as possible and get a written assessment of the damage. This is all going into the lawsuit." Saturday morning, I was working in my home office when I heard a sound like a gunshot echo through the neighborhood. I ran to the window but didn't see anything unusual. Then my phone rang. "Wesley, get outside," Tom said, his voice excited. "You need to see this." I grabbed my coat and headed out. Several neighbors were standing in the street, all looking toward Karren's house. I couldn't see what they were looking at from my angle, so I walked down the sidewalk. When I reached the point where I could see Karren's backyard, I understood. Her deck had completely collapsed. The entire structure, which had been even larger than mine, was now a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal. The ice that had accumulated on it over the past week had been too much for the support posts, and the whole thing had come down. I could see Karren standing in her backyard, still in her bathrobe, staring at the destruction. "Holy crap," I said. "The irony is unbelievable," Tom said, walking up beside me. "She destroyed your heating cables, and now her deck collapsed from ice weight." "Did she have heating cables?" "She did, actually. But she had them removed last fall because she decided they were too expensive to run. She kept saying that people in Colorado had lived without them for generations, and they were just a waste of money." I felt a mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated, seeing Karren face consequences for her actions. But another part of me, the part that had grown up with parents who taught empathy and kindness, felt bad for her. A deck collapse was a serious problem, and the repair costs would be substantial. Those mixed feelings lasted until Monday morning, when I received a certified letter from the HOA. Karren had filed a formal complaint against me, claiming that my security cameras had captured footage of her property without consent and violated her privacy. She was demanding that I remove the cameras immediately and pay a fine of $500 for the privacy violation. She also claimed that my failure to remove the heating cables had created a neighborhood hazard, and that I was responsible for setting a bad example that led to property damage throughout the subdivision. The audacity was breathtaking. She destroyed my property. Her deck had collapsed because she refused to properly winterize it, and now she was trying to blame me and fine me for protecting my property. Patricia Morrison laughed when I forwarded her the letter. "This is perfect," she said. "She's digging herself deeper. We're going to add harassment to the lawsuit, and this letter is going to be Exhibit A. She's essentially admitting that she didn't want you to have cameras because she knew she was doing something wrong. Can she actually fine me? No. Well, technically the HOA can assess fines for valid violations, but everything she's claiming is bogus. Your cameras are legal, your heating cables were installed before you moved in, and you've done nothing to cause damage to anyone else's property. We'll fight any fines in court." The structural engineer came out Tuesday afternoon. He spent 2 hours examining my deck, taking measurements and documenting the ice damage. His report was sobering. The ice weight had caused the main support beam to crack, and 2 of the support posts had shifted on their foundations. The deck was still standing, but it was unsafe to use and needed immediate repairs estimated at $12,000. "The good news is that it didn't collapse," he told me. "If you'd had those heating cables running, none of this would have happened. The ice buildup would have been minimal." I added his report to the growing file of evidence. Patricia assured me we had an excellent case, but she warned that these things took time. HOA cases can drag on for months, sometimes over a year, she said. "Karren's going to fight this, and she's got the HOA's resources behind her." Wednesday brought another surprise. I received a call from the police detective handling my vandalism case. "Mr. Quinn, we've completed our investigation, and we're recommending charges against Karren Jenkins for criminal mischief in the 2nd degree. The DA has agreed to prosecute." "That's great," I said, surprised at how quickly things had moved. The video evidence was compelling, and we also found security camera footage from your neighbor's house that shows Miss Jenkins approaching your property the night before you discovered the cut cables. She's going to be charged, and there will be a court hearing. What does that mean for her? Criminal mischief in the 2nd degree is a Class 2 misdemeanor in Colorado when the damage is between $500 and $1,000. But your damages exceed that, so it could potentially be elevated to a Class 4 felony if the DA decides to pursue it aggressively. She's looking at potential jail time and restitution. After I hung up, I sat in my home office, trying to process everything. What had started as a simple HOA dispute had escalated into criminal charges and a major lawsuit. I hadn't wanted any of this. I just wanted to live peacefully in my house and keep ice from damaging my property. Karren was arrested Thursday morning. I didn't witness it, but Tom called me with the news. "Sheriff's deputies just took her away in handcuffs," he said. "The whole neighborhood saw it. People are going crazy on Facebook." I pulled up the Pinewood Estates group and scrolled through dozens of new posts. Some people were defending Karren, claiming she was being persecuted for doing her duty as HOA president. Others were celebrating, sharing their own stories of Karren's overreach and petty tyranny. A few people shared that they'd also had problems with property damage and suspected Karren, but had never been able to prove it. One post caught my attention. A woman named Sarah, who lived 4 streets over, wrote that Karren had allegedly poisoned her rose bushes 2 years ago because they extended slightly over the property line into the common area. Another resident claimed Karren had filed false reports with the city about unpermitted construction, leading to expensive inspections and delays. The more I read, the clearer it became that Karren had a long history of using her position to harass and intimidate residents. Karren was released on bond that same afternoon. Her husband, a real estate developer named Karren Jenkins, posted a long statement on Facebook defending her and threatening legal action against anyone spreading false accusations. He claimed that Karren was the victim of a witch hunt and that Wesley Quinn, meaning me, had orchestrated a campaign to remove her from the HOA board. That last part was absurd since I'd barely been involved in HOA matters before this incident. But Richard's post got plenty of support from Karren's friends and allies in the neighborhood. The subdivision was clearly divided into pro-Karren and anti-Karren factions. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Patricia Morrison advised me to attend. "You need to be visible," she said. "Don't be confrontational, but don't hide either. You're the victim here, and the board needs to understand that their president committed a crime." The meeting was held at the subdivision clubhouse, a nice facility with a meeting room that could hold about 50 people. When I arrived 15 minutes early, there were already 40 people there, with more streaming in. The room was packed by the time the meeting started, standing room only, with people clearly there because of the Karren situation. Karren sat at the head table with 4 other board members. She looked composed and defiant, dressed in a business suit as if she were attending a corporate board meeting rather than a volunteer HOA gathering. She avoided making eye contact with me. The meeting started with standard business, approving minutes from the previous meeting, discussing budget items, and reviewing upcoming maintenance projects. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone waited for the real drama. Finally, Karren addressed what she called recent unfortunate incidents in the neighborhood. She spoke for 10 minutes, presenting herself as a dedicated public servant who had been falsely accused by a new resident who didn't understand or respect the subdivision's rules. She claimed that she'd never vandalized anyone's property, and that the criminal charges were based on circumstantial evidence and a personal vendetta. When she finished, she opened the floor for comments. I raised my hand immediately. "Yes, Mr. Quinn," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. I stood up so everyone could see me. "I want to be clear about the facts," I said. "I moved into this neighborhood 8 months ago. I've paid my HOA dues on time, maintained my property, and followed all reasonable rules." The heating cables that Karren claims were unauthorized were installed by the previous owner and were already in place when I bought the house. I had no reason to believe they were problematic. "The covenants clearly state that all exterior modifications require approval," Karren interrupted. "I didn't modify anything. The cables were already there. But even if they were a violation, which I dispute, that doesn't give you the right to destroy them. You're supposed to send notices, hold hearings, and assess fines. You don't get to vandalize property." "I never vandalized anything." "Then explain why you were captured on video entering my property with bolt cutters 3 days after my cables were cut. Explain why the cable housing shows tool marks consistent with heavy-duty cutters. Explain why you specifically targeted the 3 points that would disable the entire system." The room erupted in conversation. Karren banged her gavel, calling for order. Another resident, an older man named Frank, stood up. "I think we need to address this directly. Karren, did you cut Wesley's heating cables?" "I've already answered this question for the police." "I'm not going to keep defending myself against baseless accusations." "That's not an answer," Frank said. "This is a simple yes or no question. I refuse to dignify this witch hunt with a response." Another board member, a woman named Jennifer, spoke up. "Karren, I think you need to step down as president, at least temporarily, while this legal situation is resolved. The subdivision can't have a president who's facing criminal charges. I'm not stepping down, Karren said firmly. I was elected by the residents to serve a 3-year term, and I'm going to fulfill my duties regardless of these false charges. The meeting devolved into chaos, with people shouting over each other. Some residents demanded Karren's resignation, while her supporters rallied to her defense. Finally, Jennifer made a motion to hold a special election for HOA president. The motion was seconded, and after 20 minutes of heated debate, it passed by a vote of 3-2, with Karren and one other board member voting against it. Karren was furious. She adjourned the meeting abruptly and stormed out, her husband following close behind. I left feeling exhausted but cautiously optimistic. At least some of the board members were willing to hold her accountable. The criminal case moved forward quickly. Karren's arraignment was scheduled for early February, and the prosecutor offered her a plea deal. Plead guilty to misdemeanor criminal mischief, pay restitution for the full cost of repairs and damages, and resign from the HOA board. If she refused, they'd pursue felony charges. According to Patricia Morrison, who had connections in the DA's office, Karren refused the plea deal. She was convinced she could beat the charges at trial. "That's good for us on the civil side," Patricia said. "If she's convicted at trial, it makes our lawsuit much stronger." A criminal conviction for property damage is pretty much conclusive evidence for civil liability. While all this was happening, I had to deal with the practical problem of my damaged deck. I hired a contractor to make the necessary repairs, which ended up costing $14,000 once all the issues were discovered. The main beam had to be replaced, 2 support posts needed to be reset on new concrete footings, and several sections of decking had warped from ice damage and needed to be torn out and rebuilt. The heating cables were repaired and back in operation, keeping ice from accumulating. I made sure to document everything with photos and receipts, knowing it would all be needed for the lawsuit. Karren's criminal trial was set for March. In Colorado, misdemeanor trials can happen relatively quickly if both sides are ready to proceed. The prosecutor was confident in the case, and Karren's attorney apparently believed they could create reasonable doubt about who had actually cut the cables. I was called to testify on the second day of the trial. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with maybe 20 people in the gallery, including several Pinewood Estates residents who had come to watch. The prosecutor, an assistant DA named Michael Torres, walked me through the timeline. I explained how I discovered the cut cables, the damage they caused, and the confrontation with Karren when I caught her returning with bolt cutters. "Did Miss Jenkins ever admit to cutting the cables?" Torres asked. "Not directly, but she didn't deny it either. She said the cables were unauthorized and needed to be removed. She was carrying bolt cutters and trying to access my backyard. What happened as a result of the destroyed heating cables? Ice accumulated on my deck and patio. The weight caused structural damage that cost $14,000 to repair. It also could have been much worse. My neighbor's deck actually collapsed from ice weight." Karren's attorney, a slick-looking guy named David something, cross-examined me aggressively. He tried to suggest that the cables might have been damaged by falling ice, animals, or other causes. He questioned why I hadn't installed security cameras earlier if I was so concerned about my property. He implied that I was pursuing charges out of spite because Karren had cited me for HOA violations. "Isn't it true that you were angry about receiving violation notices from the HOA?" he asked. I was frustrated that Karren was targeting me for things the previous owner had installed, I said. But I wasn't angry enough to make up a story about her vandalizing my property. The evidence speaks for itself. The most damaging testimony came from Tom, my neighbor. He testified that his security cameras had captured footage of Karren walking down the street toward my house at 11:30 the night before I discovered the cut cables. His camera angle didn't show her actually entering my property, but it showed her walking in that direction with what appeared to be tools in her hand. 30 minutes later, his camera caught her walking back toward her house. The prosecutor also called the heating cable installation technician as an expert witness. He testified that the cuts were clean and deliberate, made with professional-grade tools, and positioned exactly where they'd cause maximum damage to the system. This wasn't accidental, he said. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Karren took the stand in her own defense, which Patricia later told me was a risky move. She testified that she'd never been on my property the night in question, and that she'd been home with her husband the entire evening. She claimed the video of her walking toward my house with bolt cutters 3 days later was taken out of context. She said she'd been conducting a routine HOA inspection, and the bolt cutters were for removing an unauthorized fence extension at another property, not for cutting my cables. The prosecution showed surveillance footage from my cameras, showing her clearly attempting to enter my backyard gate. When asked why she'd need bolt cutters for an inspection, she gave a rambling answer about needing to document potential violations and possibly needing to remove hazardous materials. Her husband Richard testified that Karren had been home with him the night the cables were cut, but his testimony was vague and unconvincing. He couldn't remember specific details about what they'd done that evening, what they'd watched on TV, or when they'd gone to bed. The trial lasted 3 days total. Closing arguments were compelling on both sides. The defense attorney emphasized reasonable doubt, suggesting that while Karren might have made poor decisions about HOA enforcement, there was no definitive proof she'd cut the cables. The prosecutor painted a picture of an out-of-control HOA president who thought she was above the law and took it upon herself to destroy property she didn't approve of. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict: guilty of criminal mischief in the 2nd degree. Karren's face went pale as the verdict was read. Her husband put his arm around her shoulders, and I could see her crying. Despite everything she'd done, I felt a moment of sympathy. This was going to change her life significantly. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. In the meantime, the civil lawsuit moved forward. Patricia filed for summary judgment, arguing that the criminal conviction proved liability and the only remaining question was damages. The special HOA election happened in April. Karren had officially resigned from the board after her conviction, though she claimed it was voluntary and unrelated to the criminal case. Jennifer, the board member who'd pushed for accountability, ran for president and won easily. One of her first acts was to review and clarify the architectural guidelines, making it explicit that heating cables and similar winterizing systems were allowed without special approval. She also called me personally to apologize on behalf of the HOA. "What happened to you was unacceptable," she said. "The board should have reined Karren in years ago. We all knew she was overstepping, but no one wanted to deal with the drama of confronting her." Karren's sentencing hearing was emotional. She read a statement claiming she'd only been trying to protect property values and enforce the rules fairly. She said she'd never meant to cause significant damage and that she'd been under tremendous stress dealing with difficult residents. The judge wasn't sympathetic. "Miss Jenkins, you held a position of trust in your community, and you abused that position. You took it upon yourself to destroy another person's property rather than following proper procedures. Your actions caused significant financial harm and could have endangered safety if that deck had collapsed while someone was on it. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was deliberate, planned vandalism. She was sentenced to 90 days in jail, with 60 days suspended, meaning she'd serve 30 days. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $17,000, covering my cable repairs, deck repairs, and associated costs. She was placed on 2 years of probation and ordered to complete anger management counseling. The civil lawsuit settled shortly after the sentencing. Karren's homeowner's insurance initially refused to cover the damages, arguing that intentional acts weren't covered. But Patricia pushed hard, and eventually they settled for $45,000, covering my actual damages plus punitive damages and legal fees. Karren and Richard would have to reimburse their insurance company, but that was their problem, not mine. I attended one more HOA meeting in May, mainly to show support for Jennifer and the new board. The atmosphere was completely different from the chaotic meeting in February. Business was conducted efficiently and professionally. When Jennifer opened the floor for resident comments, several people thanked me for standing up to Karren and bringing accountability to the board. "You did what a lot of us wanted to do but were too scared to try," Frank, the older resident who'd confronted Karren, told me. She'd been running roughshod over this neighborhood for years. Someone needed to stop her. I moved on with my life, focusing on work and enjoying my newly repaired deck. The heating cables worked perfectly through the rest of the winter, and I had no further ice problems. My security cameras stayed up, and while a few Karren supporters gave me dirty looks when I saw them around the neighborhood, most people were friendly. Karren served her 30 days in the county jail that summer. When she got out, she and Richard kept a low profile. Their collapsed deck was eventually rebuilt, and I noticed they had heating cables installed on the new structure. I found that ironic, but didn't comment on it. Tom remained a good friend and neighbor. We'd barbecue on my deck sometimes, and he'd joke about how it was the most expensive deck in the subdivision, given all the repairs and legal drama. He wasn't wrong. The whole experience taught me several important lessons about HOAs, property rights, and standing up for yourself. I learned that documentation is crucial. If I hadn't taken detailed photos, gotten expert assessments, and installed those security cameras, I might never have been able to prove what Karren had done. I learned that bullies often back down when confronted with evidence and consequences. And I learned that sometimes doing the right thing means enduring conflict and stress, even when you'd rather just avoid the whole situation. One afternoon in June, I was working on my laptop on the deck when Jennifer stopped by. She was making the rounds talking to residents about a proposed special assessment for some common area improvements. "I wanted to thank you again," she said after we discussed the assessment. "Since Karren left, we've had fewer complaints, fewer violations, and generally happier residents." She was creating problems where none existed. "I didn't set out to be a troublemaker," I said. "You weren't. You were just someone who refused to be pushed around. That's different." After she left, I sat on my deck looking out at the Colorado mountains in the distance. The deck that had caused so much trouble was now one of my favorite places. I'd added some comfortable furniture, put in a new grill, and even hung some string lights that I'd carefully confirmed were HOA approved. Max came out and lay down in a patch of sunlight, content, and oblivious to all the drama his owner had been through. I scratched behind his ears and thought about how different my first year in Pinewood Estates had been from what I'd expected. The neighborhood had seemed so peaceful when I'd bought the house. I'd imagined quiet evenings, friendly neighbors, and simple suburban life. Instead, I'd gotten vandalism, criminal trials, lawsuits, and neighborhood division. But I'd also gotten justice, made some good friends, and helped bring about positive change in the HOA. Tom came over later with a six-pack of beer, and we sat on the deck talking about everything except HOAs and Karren. We talked about work, sports, and his upcoming vacation. It felt normal and peaceful, exactly what I'd wanted when I'd moved here. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I realized I was finally settling into the life I'd hoped for. The drama was behind me. Karren was out of power. My deck was solid and ice-free. The neighborhood was healing. I never saw Karren around much after that summer. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and Richard were considering selling their house and moving. The criminal conviction and lawsuit had tarnished her reputation, and I suspected she couldn't stand being just a regular resident after years of wielding HOA authority. In August, I noticed a for sale sign go up in front of their house. Tom texted me a photo with the caption, "End of an era." The house sold quickly despite the visibly new deck that clearly indicated recent repairs. The new owners were a young couple with twin toddlers who seemed nice, and most importantly, had no interest in joining the HOA board. I ran into Richard at the grocery store a few days before they moved. We made eye contact across the produce section, and for a moment, I thought he might confront me. Instead, he just looked away and pushed his cart down another aisle. I felt bad for him in some ways. He'd stood by Karren through everything, but her actions had ultimately cost them their home and standing in the community. The final chapter in the saga came in September, when I received a letter from Patricia Morrison. Karren and Richard had filed for bankruptcy, listing my settlement, the insurance reimbursement, and the cost of rebuilding their deck among their debts. The bankruptcy wouldn't affect my settlement since I'd already been paid, but it showed just how completely the situation had unraveled for them. "This whole thing destroyed their finances," Patricia explained when I called her. Between legal fees, court costs, restitution, the settlement, and their deck repairs, they were looking at over $200,000 in unexpected expenses. They couldn't recover from that. I felt a complex mix of emotions. I'd never wanted to destroy anyone's life. I just wanted to protect my property and hold someone accountable for breaking the law. But Karren's choices had led to consequences far beyond what either of us had probably imagined. That night, she cut my heating cables. Fall came to Colorado, and the leaves changed colors beautifully. The subdivision looked peaceful, with well-maintained yards and happy families. The new HOA board under Jennifer's leadership was functioning well, handling routine business without drama. Several residents had told me they were actually reading the meeting minutes now because things were getting done efficiently. I hosted a deck party in October, inviting Tom and several other neighbors I'd gotten to know through the whole ordeal. We grilled burgers, drank beer, and enjoyed the crisp autumn evening. No one mentioned Karren or the past year's drama. We were all ready to move forward. As winter approached again, I checked my heating cables carefully, making sure they were in perfect working order. The first snow came in November, a light dusting that melted by afternoon. My cables kicked on automatically, keeping ice from forming on the deck surfaces. The system worked exactly as it was supposed to, protecting my property just like it would have a year earlier if Karren had left it alone. I thought about how different this winter would be. No drama, no vandalism, no lawsuits, just peaceful enjoyment of my home and property. It had taken a lot of stress, time, and money to get here, but it was worth it. The security cameras stayed up, still recording 24/7. I checked the footage occasionally out of habit, but there was never anything interesting. Just the occasional deer wandering through, squirrels raiding the bird feeder, and Max doing his business in his designated corner of the yard. Jennifer stopped by one last time before the holidays to drop off some cookies and thank me for attending HOA meetings regularly. "You've become one of our most engaged residents," she said, "which is funny considering how things started." "I never wanted to be involved in HOA politics," I admitted, "but after everything that happened, I figured I should pay attention to make sure things stay on track." "Well, we appreciate it, and I hope you know that what Karren did doesn't represent what HOAs are supposed to be about. We're supposed to maintain property values and create a nice community, not destroy people's property and harass residents. I know, you and the new board have been great." She left, and I spent the evening hanging holiday decorations, making sure to take them down before January 15th to avoid any potential violations, though I doubted anyone would care. That was the old HOA. This was something different and better. Looking back on everything, I realized that standing up to Karren had been one of the hardest but most important things I'd done. It would have been easier to just remove the heating cables, accept her authority, and try to stay under her radar. But that would have meant letting a bully win and setting a precedent that she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. Instead, I'd fought back with evidence, legal process, and persistence. I'd held her accountable through both the criminal and civil systems. And in doing so, I'd helped free an entire neighborhood from her tyrannical approach to HOA governance. The heating cables hummed quietly, doing their job, keeping ice at bay. My deck stood solid and strong, completely repaired from the damage her vandalism had caused. The security cameras watched over everything, a silent deterrent to anyone who might think about causing problems. As I settled into my second winter in Pinewood Estates, I felt genuinely happy with my decision to buy this house. The neighborhood drama had been terrible, but it had also brought unexpected benefits. I'd made good friends, learned important lessons about property law and personal rights, and helped create positive change in the community. Max curled up next to me on the couch as I watched snow begin to fall outside. The heating cables would keep the deck clear. The house would stay warm and comfortable. And I would sleep well knowing that bullies don't always win, that justice sometimes actually works, and that standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult, is always the right choice. The saga of HOA Karren, who cut my outdoor heating cable and then watched her entire deck collapse from ice weight, was finally, completely over. I'd won, not because I'd wanted revenge or conflict, but because I'd refused to be a victim and had insisted on accountability. That felt like the right way to start my life in this neighborhood, and everything that came after would be built on that foundation of standing up for what was right.